Why the Left Hates America. It's about an hour.
I want to begin by retelling a story that I discuss in my book. And it involves a British general named Charles Napier who during, basically at the height of the British Empire when, the sun was never setting on the British Empire and all that kind of nonsense, he was a conqueror. He conquered part of India known as the Sindh, basically present-day Pakistan. And there was something that he saw there that greatly offended his English gentlemanly sensibilities. And that was a practice known as the sati, which basically involved women being culturally coerced into jumping on the funeral pyres of their husbands. And the message there was unmistakable, that if your husband is dead, you're dead. Your life is no longer worth living. And so he said, look, this is going to end. And this greatly offended the Brahmins, the local Brahmins who ran things. And they said, look, this is our tradition. We've been doing this for a long time, certainly longer than you guys have been here. You cannot stop it. This is our custom. To which the general curtly replied, my nation also has a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them. Let us all act according to custom. Now, what do you think happened there? Basically, in that part of India, at least while this guy was in charge, that practice petered out a bit. It didn't happen as much. My point in telling the story is that on campus today, a story like this, the bad guy is the general, is not the Brahmins who were forcing the women to kill themselves, but it's the general. Because the mantra we hear from the relativists that have a dominant position within higher education is who's to say? Who are we to say that one culture's practices are better than the other? Who are we to judge? What I'm trying to say here today is that we're human beings. We have the ability to inspect, evaluate, and judge. You shouldn't leash your brain off to some ideology and basically say, I'm a mere human being, I can't judge, I can't tell if one is better than the other. Cultural practices are not merely different. Some are better, some are worse. And I think as human beings we can take an objective look at some of them and determine which ones work and which ones don't, which ones are destructive and harmful and which ones are good. My second problem with relativists and multiculturalists is that they tell us, don't judge. At the same time they look at other cultures and say, don't judge what these people are doing. They look at our own culture and issue the most judgmental condemnations that you can imagine about our own culture. They have a double standard. It's a hypocrisy. They look at other cultures and they say, cast a blind eye to that. You can't say whether it's right or wrong. But when they look at America in the West, they're pretty severe in promiscuously hurling about condemnations of our society. This was particularly true after 9/11. We saw on the campuses, and I'm not necessarily saying at DePaul, but in general, there was a gulf between the reaction to 9/11 in mainstream society, which was a reaction that involved hanging flags from highway overpasses, donating money, grieving, donating time. This was the reaction in mainstream America. The reaction on the campuses was quite different. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. At University of New Mexico, Professor Richard Berthold told his class on that fateful morning, anyone who can blow up the Pentagon would get my vote. He had time to think about it. He repeated this to his next class. At Brown, shortly thereafter 9/11, a speaker at a rally said, the American flag is nothing but a symbol of hate and should be used for toilet paper for all I care. Lisa Mann of Wake Forest University, a student columnist, said, we are kidding ourselves into thinking we've been wrong. This is immediately after the attacks. Sometimes it is our fault. That's right, America is not a nice country. An activist at the University of Colorado simply maintained, we had it coming. Now, I go on for pages and pages and pages in my book about examples like this, and I'm not going to bore you with them. You get the idea. My point in telling them is that we hear a lot about tolerance on the campuses. And if you hate America, the campuses are indeed a very tolerant place. But if you love America, sometimes they can be about as tolerant as Iran. Let me give you an indication of what I'm talking about. At Marquette University in Milwaukee, a group of students on 9/11 wanted to have a moment of silence around an American flag. The university administration denied them this right. They said that this would alienate foreign students, that it was offensive, and that it was inappropriate to hang a flag on 9/11. I mean, if it's inappropriate to hang a flag on September 11th, what day of the year would it be appropriate to hang a flag? I mean, the answer for these folks is obviously never. Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, a vice president of the school caught sight of an American flag hanging from a university bus. He issued an order to take down that flag and all the others, and because it was offensive. The American flag offensive. At Holy Cross College in Worcester, Mass., the chairman of the sociology department caught sight of an American flag outside of his office, and the receptionist in the department had put it up, and she was honoring one of her friends that died in one of the flights, Flight 93. This was Todd Beamer. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Todd Beamer. And the chairman of the department said, it is greatly offensive to myself and to other members of the department. You need to take it down. And she refused. And so he went and ripped the flag down himself. It's not like these folks were putting up a swastika or a sickle and hammer. They were putting up the Stars and Stripes, the flag of this country. The reaction people have sometimes to hateful flags is one of disgust. Why someone would have that same reaction to the American flag is a bit puzzling to me. I think the answer is because these people hate what America stands for. They're perfectly willing to tolerate the most gross and indecent statements against this country, which is fine. We have the right to free speech. The last thing I want to do is take away someone's right to free speech. I mean, obviously, I enjoy that right, and when I go to the campuses, sometimes that right gets taken away a little bit, but I enjoy it, particularly at a place like here. And so I don't want to take anyone's free speech rights away. But at the same time, these guys have a free speech right to say whatever hateful things they want to say. I have a right to refute them, and that's why I came here today, to refute some of these folks. We also see in Hollywood a great deal of anti-Americanism. Certainly, you know, we see movies like Saving Private Ryan and We Were Soldiers, Black Hawk Down, that celebrate some of the virtues of the military in this country, but we also see a lot of movies, say like The Rock, or basically any Vietnam War era movie, besides ones made by like Chuck Norris or the recent one by Mel Gibson. They depict American soldiers as doped out losers, psychopaths. They don't give a particularly sterling presentation of the American military and of America in general. This is in sharp contrast to what we saw in the 40s and 50s. People nowadays say things like Sands of Iwo Jima was a jingoistic war movie or something like that. But the events in Sands of Iwo Jima, I mean, loosely based upon what happened, that really happened. American soldiers stormed that island. Marines flew the flag atop Mount Suribachi and all that kind of thing. The events in movies like The Rock or The Deer Hunter, what are they based on? They're based on the warped imagination of some screenwriter or some director about what it was really like in Vietnam. Most of them, other than Oliver Stone, I can't think of too many that were actually over there. So what we saw in Hollywood after 9/11, a guy like Woody Harrelson, Hoosier, Indiana native, grew up here, saying things like the war on terrorism is terrorism. Or a few weeks back, he wrote in the Manchester Guardian that if we were to go to war in Iraq, we would be creating, the United States would be creating our second war in less than a year. Now, I don't know about you guys. I saw what happened on 9/11. We were attacked. There's no amount of mental gymnastics that you can perform that can erase that fact. We were not the perpetrators of that act. We were the victims. And yet you hear from a guy like Woody Harrelson that we were somehow responsible for it. And that's nonsense. Danny Glover gave a speech after 9/11 at a campus where he said that one of the main purveyors of violence in this world is the United States. The director, fellow who made MASH in Gosford Park, Altman, he was over in England saying the American flag makes me sick. There were a lot of these idiotic, hateful statements. There were some that were just plain idiotic, that I don't think that were anti-American, things that Barbara Streisand and Harry Belafonte and some of these other folks said, Jessica Lange. Those are kind of in the idiotic category. The ones that Woody Harrelson and Altman and Glover said, I think, would put them in the anti-American category. And that's to say that their criticism of this country is a reflexive anti-Americanism. It's not a thought-out critique. Frederick Douglass said something to the effect that the true patriot is the one who rebukes and does not excuse his nation's sins. And I think there's a lot of truth in that statement. I don't want to give the impression tonight that I am against any sort of constructive criticism of this country. We're not perfect. But what we see on the left, and guys like in Hollywood and on the campuses, is a reflexive, knee-jerk anti-Americanism. Whatever the fault, whatever the problem in the world, whether it's debt in Africa or some guy needing a job in South America or an ecological catastrophe halfway around the world, invariably for these folks, the fault is always America. It's always a blame America chorus that comes out. And nowhere, at no time have we seen the idiocy of such a way of viewing the world after 9/11, where basically these people still had their stock answers. It's America's fault, and yet it was plain as day that it wasn't America's fault, that we were attacked by a bunch of crazies from the Middle East. I mean, that was quite obvious. Now, what's the left's basic problem? I think there are two failures in their way of analyzing things. One is that they have a false view of the world, or a very naive view of the world outside of our cultural borders. Rather than look at the world as it actually is, they project their own view of upon the rest of the world. Books like I, Rigoberta Menchú, that was quite popular and still is quite popular on college campuses. It was a total fraud. The book was made up. The author won the Nobel Prize for Peace, but that doesn't escape the fact that she made up the entire book. It was a concoction. And yet this was one of the most popular books on campuses for well over a decade, and it's still being taught today without any sort of caveat that it's basically fiction. Well, what did this book purport to find? They found that the typical Central American Indian believed in all of the same faddish causes that the typical sociology professor believed in, that they were against homophobia and for liberation theology and for the environment and all this kind of thing. It really massaged the worldview of the typical American college professor. That's why it was taught. It had nothing to do with telling about what actually was going on in these places, what reality is in these places. It just massaged the intellectual view of a lot of Western academics. That's why it was taught. If multiculturalism were about celebrating other cultures or even just looking at them, I don't think there would be much of a problem. There would be no controversy if we were to learn about the Bhagavad Gita or learn the life of Muhammad or have student exchange programs or learn foreign languages. There would be no politically charged controversy. But because multiculturalism is often about not celebrating other cultures or even inspecting them, but about debasing our own, there is a lot of controversy. The second problem is that I think the left has a basic ignorance of what goes on in this country. And so I want to go to the first one, the ignorance about the rest of the world. The left's problem basically is that they look at America and they compare America to an ideal. If you compare anything to an ideal, it's going to fall short. I mean, Barry Bonds did not hit 1,000 last year playing in the major leagues. That doesn't mean he had a bad season. He had a great season. We don't compare things in the world we live in to ideals, to fantasy lands. We compare them to things that actually exist in the world. Compare Barry Bonds to other players in the National League. He looks pretty exemplary. That's the same way I would ask that you look at America and its position in the world. Don't compare America to an ideal. Compare America to what actually exists in the world. Because when we compare America to what actually exists in the world, we look rather exemplary. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. In China, for every 117 baby boys that are born, there's 100 baby girls that are born. Now, why is this? This is because they force women to have abortions, and secondly, because the culture values males more than they do females. And so you have a horrific situation like this where you have more than 100 million men in China than women. Everywhere else it's the opposite. You have more women. In India, every year there are thousands and thousands of dowry killings. In the year 2000 there were about 7,000 dowry killings. Basically a woman goes into a marriage, her new family doesn't like the amount of money she brings with her into it that her old family gave to the new family, and so they kill her as an act of retribution. This happens about 7,000 times a year. How many dowry killings were there last year in the United States? And give me a break. There were none.